Okay. Glenn, thanks for coming back on here and spending some time to talk about another volatile and very interesting area of the world, this time really squarely in the Middle East, Lebanon, Israel, Hamas.
Great to see you, Ryan. And yeah, happy to talk about this fascinating region that we call the Levant. Yeah.
And since we're talking Lebanon, obviously, for people who have not been following along over the past week or so, some pretty big movements with a president appointed, obviously stark changes with Hezbollah in the region that we'll get into. But just to provide some context for folks, you know this region very well. I was just wondering if you have anything that comes to mind from time that you have spent in Lebanon before we dig into some of the politics behind it.
Yeah. Listen, I mean, I say this about a lot of places, but the Lebanese are incredible people. They're wonderful people. It's a beautiful country, incredible history, culture, food, great wine. For those of you who are wine drinkers out there, if you're not wine drinkers, I hope I didn't offend you with that. But now, amazing like culture. Actually, good beer called Almaza, draft beer. And so what I'm going to say during the interview, I mean, in the last month or so, there's been some really very positive changes, which I am very happy to see, because I think the Lebanese people need some good news after years of going through some very, very hard times for a number of reasons. But much of it caused by Iran, the Islamic Republic, and their proxy, Lebanese Hezbollah, in my assessment.
Yeah.
Some caused by themselves, but I mean, that's any country.
I think you often hear about Lebanon in particular, how vibrant it is, the way people live, just given how volatile it can be at any given time. So I think the first thing we got to kick off with, they've been without a president for 2 years. They just appoint or elect General Joseph Aoun. Am I saying that correctly?
That's correct. Perfect pronunciation, Ryan.
So it's 2 years. 2 years without. For somebody who knows the country and the region, how does that happen? How do you go that long without a president? Why is this so important right now?
Right. So in Lebanon, the president is elected by the parliament, and that means all the factions that are in the parliament, including Lebanese Hezbollah, the different Christian parties, the Sunni parties, they all have to vote, and there has to be a consensus. And for 2+ years, Lebanese Hezbollah was blocking. They wanted one candidate that other factions were not willing, or coalition was not willing to support. And they were kind of blocking the election, in my assessment. The Hezbollah, and there's another Shia party. So Hezbollah, the Shia party, and then there's another one called Amal. And the Speaker of Parliament is also the head of that party, Amal party, Nabi Berri. And they were blocking the election of a president. In the last month or so, there was a lot of movement caused. My own assessment is what the Israelis did to Lebanese Hezbollah after 7 October, when Hezbollah made this strategic mistake of going to war or expanding their war with Israel, resulted in really serious problems for Hezbollah, Iran, in the region, in Lebanon itself, weakened their position and weakened their ability to continue to block the election of a president. And the Lebanese parliament elected a president. He was the former commander of the Lebanese Armed Forces, which is an institute which has received a lot of help and has had a lot of good collaboration with the U.S., including U.S. military, other parts of the U.S. government. So General Aoun is someone who's known to the U.S. He has a very good reputation. By the way the law is written in Lebanon, he is a Maronite Christian. So the commander of the army has to be a Maronite. And then he just nominated and secured the election, I guess we'd say, of a new prime minister, who is also very popular with many people, especially reformists in Lebanon. He was not a politician in Lebanon. He was the Lebanese ambassador to the UN for a while, and he worked in the international, the ICJ, International Court of Justice, and he was the president of that body before he returned to Lebanon to become the prime minister. So 2 very positive notes for, I would say, the legitimate authorities of Lebanon.
And that is Nawaf Salam, right?
Yes, Nawaf Salam.
So one of the things I found really interesting that you'll know, I'm sure, as you mentioned, kind of the different religions and the splits there. So not only the head of the armed forces, but the president also comes from the same Christian community The PM is from the Sunni community, and the Speaker of Parliament is from the Shia community.
Correct.
And so when you mentioned that it's the Speaker of the Parliament that calls for the election, to have a Shia, which is kind of aligned with Hezbollah, to be the one who had called this election to begin with, to give the opportunity to have a president step in, I feel like that is saying something given Hezbollah's history there with the Shia party.
Right. I would say that Amal party and Hezbollah were actually competitors for influence in the Shia community. Nabi Berri is not a member of Hezbollah, but he definitely had to consider Hezbollah's desires, especially Hassan Nasrallah when he was still alive. And so, some people say that actually Berri's very pleased with what happened because he wants to increase his own influence with the Shia community.
Interesting.
So interesting times.
Wow. Okay. And so you mentioned Nasrallah. Obviously, he's taken out in late 2024. The new leader in Hezbollah is Naim Qassem, I believe. And we're currently there's a ceasefire in place, right? So could this have happened, this election have happened without the ceasefire, without the degradation to Hezbollah, you think?
No, I don't think so.
No.
I mean, Hezbollah continued their expanded attacks against Israel since, I always say this, they were attacking Israel for years. There was this kind of low simmering war going on across the northern border of Israel. But on 7 October, Nasrallah decided to go in full with Hamas and expanded the attacks on Israel, and the Israelis responded. And they, at first, they focused on Gaza, as we all know, and then they turned their attention to their northern border, southern Lebanon, and they actually went into southern Lebanon, and they did. I think you have to give the Israelis credit for a really very well-planned and executed campaign, which resulted in basically the decapitation of Hezbollah's leadership, military leadership, operational leadership, and then Hassan Nasrallah. And obviously, most people remember the pager operation, then followed by the radios, the walkie-talkies. I think they caused just a lot of disruption in Hezbollah's ranks. And all of this has led to Hezbollah being weakened. And of course, they also went after Hezbollah and the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Quds Force in Syria. And we're working to deny them that line of communication between Iran and Lebanon. And we saw recently that actually the Syrian regime collapsed, and now the Iranians have lost that channel, and hopefully they will continue not to be able to use that channel to resupply Hezbollah. So overall, not a good picture, not a good period for Hezbollah. They're in big trouble. And the new prime minister and the new president have made it clear that they want to they want to have a good relationship with the Shia community, and they're willing to talk, I think, even to Hezbollah, but as a political party. The next step in my assessment is disarming all of Hezbollah, because Hezbollah was the only militia after the Lebanese civil war that was allowed to keep its weapons. And they had an arsenal which was probably comparable or maybe even more deadly than the Lebanese armed forces had, the legitimate military of the country.
What is the relationship between the Lebanese armed forces and Hezbollah from a military and weapons standpoint? Like, how did they coexist, if at all, over time?
It's a great question. I would say, officially they would say that we're both defending Lebanon from the threat of Israel. Unofficially, I think the Lebanese armed forces was very hesitant to do things to cross Hezbollah because it's basically a very dangerous armed militia, which again had weapons that were not only an armed militia, a terrorist group. I mean, they terrorized Lebanese politicians. They committed assassinations against many Lebanese officials. They threatened people, blackmailed people. So the Lebanese armed forces was unable to assert its control all over the country. And part of the ceasefire demands from the Israeli side was that the Lebanese armed forces and the United Nations enforce Resolution 1701, which means that they have to control the southern border, not to allow any terrorist groups to attack Israel. That was agreed to in 2006 after the Israeli-Lebanese war then, and the Lebanese armed forces never carried out that mission. They were unable to. Now they probably have the opportunity to do it, and they are committed to doing that. That's what the commander of the army, now the president, said. And of course, my assessment is they're going to be looking for help from the U.S., from our European allies, to solidify the gains they've made in over control of overall Lebanese territory, and hopefully that assistance will be provided.
What's the regional dynamic now? Like, who are the winners and losers in that region with this change?
I think the winners are the Lebanese people, number one. I mean, just if you look internally, this is a good thing for the people of Lebanon, because one of the things I think the U.S. and many donors were very hesitant to provide aid to Lebanon as long as Hezbollah had so much influence, and they could continue to hold the government. They had an acting prime minister. Many of the positions were not filled in the government, or were filled by acting, not permanently elected officials. And so Washington wanted, the Biden administration wanted to see a legitimate government in place. And I think the Saudis, who have been big supporters of Lebanon, especially the Sunni community, to a lesser extent the Qataris, maybe the Emiratis. I just read today the Emiratis are reopening their embassy in Beirut. A large shipment of aid just arrived from Abu Dhabi. So you could say that they're winners. The U.S., I think, is a winner if we take advantage of this opportunity, because we could stabilize the region. There's so much potential in not only in Lebanon, but in the region, right? I think probably the Israelis are the winners, because they have at least set back a very, very existential threat that existed to Israel. They've kind of set that threat back many years, hopefully. Significantly. And hopefully, I mean, in my assessment, the best thing that we can do is finish that off, so that Hezbollah, the Iranians, can no longer use Lebanon as an aircraft carrier, as a platform to attack Israel.
And then by extension, the way you're describing that, I mean, Iran has to come out as a loser in this to some degree, with the degradation of Hezbollah, the axis of resistance across the board. I have to imagine this is just a really tough time for them.
When all this, when 7 October happened, I said that Iran has to think very carefully about using Hezbollah. It's their best pawn in the region. And they made the mistake of using him, and the Israelis, I think, caught them completely off guard with how effective their operations were. Apparently, the Israelis were collecting very effective intelligence on Hezbollah for years, and then they used it to support their air campaign, their ground campaign. And so, and by the way, you got hats off. I mean, that was probably seems like a great operation on their side. A lot of discipline to do that, and dedication. But the Israelis did that because they knew how dangerous Hezbollah had a weapons arsenal that could have caused serious damage. And there was a lot of speculation, including people here in the United States, experts who were saying that the Israelis should not really expand their war against Hezbollah, because Hezbollah would launch a massive strike on Israel. And the Israelis kind of ignored that advice, and they did what they did. And again, I think the Israelis are probably a winner here for now. Of course, the Israelis can now send their not their settlers, but their citizens back to the north. I think there were about 70,000 Israelis, 70,000 Israelis that were displaced from the north. Now they can go back to their homes. That should help the economy. That should help with other, social issues, because the border should be stabilized now, and the threat from southern Lebanon significantly reduced.
Obviously with the change in administrations coming up, how do you see this playing out? What would you be recommending to this new administration coming in with Lebanon specifically?
First, I would say, I mean, in terms of the change of administration, despite the serious differences in policy between the outgoing administration and incoming administration, it seems like there was a lot of very good coordination between them, and a kind of a unified line of effort towards securing a president for Lebanon. We talked about the Hamas, the ceasefire, but my understanding is there was a lot of coordination, and that's a very good sign, right? Because the incoming administration, if they were going to do things differently, that could have thrown off a lot of work that was being done by the outgoing administration. And I think definitely the incoming administration's influence had a big role in what's happened in both Lebanon and with the ceasefire in Gaza. And my advice to the new administration, if we just talk about Lebanon, and I've said this about Syria, we should be very, very serious and move very quickly to provide aid. It has to be very carefully controlled aid. We don't want it wasted. We don't want, Americans should not have their taxpayers' dollars wasted. But there should be very targeted aid to the Lebanese security forces to secure the country. Again, disarm Hezbollah. There's a lot of reconstruction that needs to happen. I think the U.S., in conjunction with the GCC countries and the Europeans, can do that. And that would be a good thing, because one of the reasons Hezbollah was so effective in the past is because the Iranians pumped a lot of money into social infrastructure, hospitals, schools, and they built equity with the Shia community and influence with that community. Somebody has to replace that. And I hope it can be the West. I would say the West.
Yeah. Even that split, I guess we should have mentioned this Sunni Shia Christian split. Christians make up, looks like 33 to 40%, Shia 30 to 35%, Sunni 25 to 30%. So obviously incredibly diverse set of people. You've been in government for 30 years, Glenn. You've seen incoming and outgoing administrations. I'm sure you've seen that work and fail miserably in those handovers. Why do you think this worked this time? Is it just the individuals who were on the incoming and outgoing coordinating? Why did it work this time around when so many times it might not?
I think because both sides knew it was good for America. I mean, this is one of those issues where, you can disagree on a lot of things, but they realize that peace between Lebanon and Israel is very important right now. I think people were probably shocked by 7 October in the outgoing administration. They were caught off guard, and it caused them serious problems. And if I were any president, or candidate, I would understand that this foreign policy issue has a direct impact on domestic politics, which we've seen in the last, since 2023. Yeah. So I think probably both sides knew that. And of course, there are some good, professionals on both sides who want to see the situation stabilized. So it's a good sign.
Just before we jump to Israel-Hamas, what's the favorite place you visited in Lebanon?
Ooh. It's hard to say favorite place. I mean, there are a lot of great places in Lebanon, in the mountains, on the coast. I've been down to the south. I've been down to the Israeli border. I was down on the Israeli border at a place called Nakura, which was in kind of Lebanese controlled territory. And I was with a Shia friend of mine, and we were looking across the border. And, he said to me, "What do you think?" And I said, "Well, I think it's sad that we can't go across that border. My brother is in Tel Aviv right now teaching. And so wouldn't it be great if we could, probably going to be like an hour drive." And there's so much in common between the Lebanese and the Israelis, from what I've seen in my life, in the visits to both those places. And I said, it's just a shame that, you can't overcome that. Maybe now there's a chance to overcome that.
Yeah.
Because ironically, the Shia and the Israelis were kind of the minorities that were pushed around or picked on by others. And so, historically, the Israelis made some serious mistakes towards the Shia community in Lebanon, I think, and it became a big problem for years. And many Israelis will admit that. So anyway, I've seen so many great places in Lebanon. I don't have a favorite place. The people were amazing, and we have many, many great Lebanese friends.
Well, let's turn to Israel-Hamas and this ceasefire that we're also looking forward to starting January 19th, 42 days. 3-phased approach. Phase 1 is release of 33 prisoners from Hamas for 1,000 prisoners on the Israeli side and some Israeli withdrawals, and then subsequent phases releasing more prisoners and more withdrawals and some reconstruction towards the end. Glenn, as you look at this, how are you thinking regionally and with the new administration? how do they approach this new opportunity in Israel?
So my assessment is that the new administration played a big role in making this happen. The President Trump's special advisor for the Middle East, Mr. Witkoff. I think my understanding is he had some very direct and blunt talks with Prime Minister Netanyahu. I think he probably explained that this is very important that this ceasefire be put in place, that we try and stabilize the crisis there for a number of reasons. My advice to the administration is that we have to be very sensitive to the realities that the Israelis are living with, because many Israelis are not happy with this ceasefire deal because it allows Hamas to continue to exist. And we shouldn't forget that Hamas is the one that started this. Hamas is the organization that launched that massive terrorist attack on 7 October. And there are many Israelis that are going to be upset because, Palestinians are being released from jail. Obviously, I think it's like for one Israeli, 30 Palestinians or 33 Palestinians. Like that's the equation. Some people, and there are definitely people already in the government now, in the coalition government, that are very upset about this and against the ceasefire deal. I think we should continue to work with Prime Minister Netanyahu and his team to encourage them to enforce the ceasefire, follow through with the phases if Hamas does what it's supposed to do. And we need to be very, very clear to Hamas. And I think President Trump made the comment, if there was not a ceasefire and the hostages are not released, it's not going to be very good for the people holding the hostages, right? And then the last part is I'm sure many people are concerned that this just sends a message that you can kidnap people and then use them as leverage, which, we've seen that with other countries where there's a lot of concern by many people now in let's say, the national security space that this trend is increasing. You kidnap someone and then you use them as trade bait or leverage to get a political objective taken care of. So
at the cost of 40,000 lives and hundreds of thousands wounded.
Yes.
I did note that Iran kind of described this as a great victory for Hamas. I assume that's a lot of positioning, but how do you read that, Glenn, from regionally?
I think it's a little posturing. I think that the Iranians, if you remember, like they were claiming that Hezbollah was winning in Lebanon. I think honestly, where we should be looking now in the next couple of months is at Iran. That's one of the countries I think we should pay a lot of attention to, because I think the Iranians are very concerned. Remember, the Trump administration won. It was the maximum pressure campaign. And the Iranians have, the Israelis demonstrated the Iranians, like the emperor has no clothes. They were able to effectively go in and conduct operations in downtown Tehran, airstrikes against the Iranians that were very effective. And a lot of the proxies, I think, are probably asking themselves now, like, who did we get in bed with? If I were a member of Hezbollah, I'd be pretty upset because the Iranians did nothing effective to help them once they unleashed them on Israel.
Why is that? That's a great point. You've got Hezbollah and Hamas fighting. Obviously, it's easier as proxies, perhaps, but why did Iran not get more involved?
I don't think the Iranians, they tried some strikes. They were not very effective. I don't think that their arsenal was as effective as they wanted people to think. And then I think they also were very afraid of the response. Right. And if I'm the Iranian leader now, I'm very worried about internal stability because I don't think that regime is very popular with the people. That's my guess. So.
And when you say we need to pay a lot of attention to Iran, how are you thinking that the administration goes about doing that?
I think, like the intelligence community is going to have to keep an eye on it. Our partners, there's opportunity, again, that's been created in the region. I've said this before. I think the Israelis and the Turks have created some very good opportunities in Syria and Lebanon right now that should be taken advantage of. So we have a lot of partners we need to work with in the region that have been very concerned about the Iranians. I mean, I guess everyone now, the big issue with Iran is their nuclear program and making sure that they don't go all the way with that. And my understanding is President Trump, after he was elected, said, I'm ready for a dialogue with the Iranians, which is interesting. And I agree with that. as long as they don't do things that are dangerous for the U.S. or their allies, including stopping their funding of terrorist groups. They're a state sponsor of terror. Uh, not supporting these militias, to use them as proxies against other countries in the region, not just Israel, but in Bahrain, in the Gulf, against the Saudis. They were very active in Iraq. So, and then maybe, and this is something I think with all these countries, we need to think about how, like, what's the carrot? We know what the stick is, but we need to be thinking, what is the carrot? Like, how do we incentivize people to change their behavior and not always resort to force or terrorism? How do we make them? There's an incentive, including for the Iranians, their economy is in a terrible condition. Is there some way we can entice them to do things differently and then reward them for doing that?
What are the other incentives beyond aid? You had mentioned like getting aid in for Lebanon. How do you see some of those other incentives?
For the Iranians or for, I think, like, less isolation, allowing them back into the, giving them some options other than having to deal with Russia and North Korea. I don't think anyone wants to be in that club. So, and I've known many Iranians in my life, and they're wonderful people, very, like, again, great culture, great history, and many Iranians are unhappy with the way what the regime has done to the country, and they feel that they've been isolated. The economy is suffering because of the ambitions of a small number of people, which are not serving the majority of the Iranian people. So
in a couple weeks we'll meet again. You'll be in Turkey, and then on your way for further travels. But as we break here, just some of the other things that are coming to mind. Obviously, we talked Syria before, a few weeks back. Lots happening there. We'll talk more Syria as it comes up. Anything else you're keeping an eye on right now? Obviously, with Ukraine, anything with Turkey, Syria, or other places you think folks should have their eye on?
Well, of course, everyone has to have their eye on the PRC in Taiwan. I'm not a big expert in that area, but there are plenty of people that are watching that. The two things I'd say are, one, we need to be looking at the Western Hemisphere more. I think this administration is showing that they are very interested in that region, mainly because of the migration problems on the southern border. So part of the solution has to be a little bit more stability in that region, and maybe putting more pressure on the regimes that are allied with our enemies, like in Venezuela and Nicaragua, that appear to be encouraging illegal migration and maybe weaponizing it, right? Which countries do. So we probably need to pay closer attention to the Western Hemisphere. And then, of course, I think we saw on, with the attacks on New Year's in the United States, terrorism is not a thing of the past. Islamic extremism is not a thing of the past, or, any kind of terrorism is not a thing of the past, and we've got to continue to pay a lot of attention to that. So I say the new administration has got a lot on its plate and is not being handed a very stable world to deal with. I'm hopeful because I think a lot of people around the world are excited about some change in Washington. I hope we can take advantage of it.
Perfect. Glenn, anything else to share before we wrap here?
No, I just want to say thank you again. It's great to see you. And next time I see you, I'm sure there'll be something exciting to talk about.
Who knows? Yeah, we should predict at some point as we do these what's going to happen next. Yes. All right. Thanks so much, Glenn. Really appreciate it. We'll talk to you next time.
Thanks, Ryan.